All right, let's dive right in. We're treating this as a formal case study, really, for anyone in the sanctions and compliance world. We're going to tackle a critical question. What are the real-world limits of economic statecraft? And believe me, the recent Hormuz crisis, it gave us some pretty stark and frankly uncomfortable answers. Let's get into the evidence.
So this is it. This is the core thesis of our entire analysis, and it's a sobering one for sure. What it's saying is that the main tool of Western foreign policy for decades now has this giant structural weakness, a weakness that the crisis in Hormuz just exposed for the whole world to see. And that really sets up our central investigation, doesn't it? How on earth did a single conflict in a single waterway manage to show the breaking point of a global system that took decades to build? That's the question we're going to answer by looking at the hard evidence.
Okay, so to prove this thesis, we're going to do a forensic analysis. We're not talking theory here, we're looking at 4 distinct, real-world examples of how sanctions enforcement just, well, it failed when it mattered most.
Our first piece of evidence is maybe the most ironic one of all. The main architect of the whole global sanctions regime, the United States, was the very first one to break its own rules.
You have to remember the context here. For years, the U.S. had been building this incredibly comprehensive sanctions regime against Russia. The G7 oil price cap was supposed to be the crown jewel of that policy. Billions were spent setting it all up, and then the Hormuz crisis hit. To deal with the global supply shortage, Washington itself authorized the release of 140 million barrels of that exact same sanctioned Russian oil.
And the result? A twofold increase in Russian oil revenues hitting $19 billion a month. But you know, the crucial point isn't just the money. It's the message this sent to every other country that was trying to comply. They were all left asking one simple, obvious question. Why did we even bother?
So, our second failure shows how a state under heavy sanctions didn't just survive this crisis, but actually managed to profit from it big time.
This slide just perfectly illustrates the huge gap between policy and what was actually happening on the ground. The official story was that Iran was isolated. The reality during the crisis? Iran was basically running a multi-million-dollar-a-day toll booth on the world's most vital waterway. And they were taking payments in Chinese yuan through a Chinese bank, from ships flagged to countries like Pakistan, India, and Turkey, countries that officially sanctioned them.
$2 million. That was the estimated price tag, per ship. This wasn't some shady, back-alley deal. This was a bold, state-run business model that was only possible because of the crisis. And it completely bypassed the entire sanctions regime.
Failure number 3 shifts our focus to a major global power. And it really shows the inability of the sanctions regime to do anything about a nation that just decides to ignore it. So get this. During the crisis, over 60% of Iran's oil exports went to China and at a huge discount. Now, in theory, U.S. secondary sanctions, the ones that target third parties doing business with a sanctioned country, they should have kicked in and penalized the Chinese firms. But in practice, with a global energy emergency raging, the risk of sanctioning China's biggest banks was just seen as too high. So China used its own financial systems and faced absolutely no consequences.
And that brings us to our final piece of evidence. This is where a key Western partner basically decided that its own national interest was way more important than any commitment to the team.
India, the world's third-largest oil consumer, didn't bother coordinating with anyone. It went straight to Tehran and cut its own deal for safe passage, using its special relationship with Iran's Chabahar port. This whole transaction happened completely outside the so-called rules-based order. It was a pure return to every nation for itself.
So after looking at these 4 failures involving the US, Iran, China, and India, we keep coming back to the same unavoidable conclusion. When a country is forced to choose between enforcing sanctions and keeping the lights on, energy security wins, every single time.
Okay, so we've laid out the evidence. Now let's move to the analysis and really unpack the deeper lesson here about the structural weaknesses of this whole approach.
This slide really breaks it down into 3 core realities for any compliance professional out there. First, sanctions frameworks are built for and absolutely depend on stability. Second, a big systemic crisis like an energy shortage forces every single country back into pure self-interest mode. And third, because of that, sanctions compliance becomes a luxury that only the most energy-secure nations can even afford to think about. So the ultimate takeaway from all this is crystal clear. You can build the most complex, robust, well-enforced sanctions architecture in history, but as the Hormuz crisis just proved to all of us, it has a single point of failure: energy.
So what does all this mean for the future? Well, that brings us to the verdict of our case study. The damage here isn't just about this one crisis. It's about the long-term credibility of sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. What the crisis revealed is something called policy incoherence. That's when your different strategies actually start working against each other. For example, the military action against Iran created the very energy crisis that directly blew up the sanctions regime against Russia, which then forced the US to break its own rules. The two strategies literally cannibalized each other.
And this forces a huge shift in how we have to think about this tool. Before the crisis, the question was always, are sanctions useful? And yeah, sure, they can be in a stable world. But the new, much more important question is, are they reliable, especially in a world that is anything but stable?
So I'll leave you with the central question this case study really poses to everyone in our field. After watching these massive failures happen in real time, are sanctions still a credible tool of statecraft? Or has the Hormuz crisis permanently damaged their effectiveness? That's the question we all have to grapple with now.